Before night fell, ancient humans had no Netflix, no doom scrolling, no late night fast food runs. Just darkness. Pure, terrifying, absolute darkness. And yet somehow they didn't just curl up in a corner and wait to die. They thrived. They laughed. They probably did some absolutely unhinged things we'd never expect. So tonight, ironically, we're diving deep into what ancient humans actually got up to after the sun went down. And spoiler alert, it's a lot weirder, a lot more social, and a lot more human than you'd think. Let's start with the obvious question everyone ignores. What even is night from an ancient human's perspective? Today, night is just the time between work and sleep. You flip a switch, your room floods with light, and night becomes basically irrelevant. But for our ancestors, we're talking Homo sapiens from 300,000 years ago all the way through early civilizations, night was a completely different dimension of existence. It was the part of the day when predators woke up, when the temperature dropped, when you genuinely could not see your hand in front of your face. Night wasn't inconvenient, night was dangerous, and that changed everything about how they behaved. But here's where it gets interesting. Researchers who've studied modern hunter-gatherer communities, groups that still live in ways closely resembling our ancient ancestors, discovered something that completely shattered the assumption that early humans just slept when it got dark. The Kung people of the Kalahari, the Hadza of Tanzania, the Juhwansi. These groups were observed staying up hours after sunset, regularly, almost every single night. Not because they had insomnia, not because they were stressed about their quarterly reviews, but because nighttime, for ancient humans, was prime social time. Think about it. During the day, everyone is busy. You're hunting, you're foraging, you're hauling water, you're keeping children from eating rocks. The usual. There's not a lot of time to just talk. But at night, around the fire, now you've got hours of unstructured, predator-deterring, warmth-providing, communal time. And ancient humans used every single second of it. Anthropologist Polly Wiesner conducted one of the most fascinating studies on this. She compared daytime conversations and nighttime conversations among the Juhwansi Bushmen of southern Africa. The results were wild. During the day, conversations were almost entirely practical. Complaints about food, disputes about resources, gossip, economic talk, standard stuff. But at night, around the fire, everything shifted. Around 80% of nighttime conversation was dedicated to storytelling. Not just any storytelling. Rich, elaborate, emotionally complex narratives involving distant places, spiritual beings, mythological events, and deeply human themes. The fire didn't just keep them warm, it transformed how they communicated. And this is where you need to stop and appreciate what's actually happening here. Storytelling isn't a hobby. It's not entertainment in the modern sense. For ancient humans, storytelling was the internet. It was the entire knowledge infrastructure of a society. Stories transmitted survival information. Where predators lurked, which plants were poisonous, where water could be found in a drought. Stories transmitted social norms. What behaviors were acceptable? What consequences awaited those who broke the rules? Stories transmitted identity. Who your people were, where you came from, what you believed. Sitting around the fire at night, listening to an elder tell a story, was one of the most cognitively and socially important activities an ancient human could do. It was basically school, therapy, law class, and religion all rolled into one extremely smoky package. And here's something even wilder about those stories. Researchers analyzing the content of fireside narratives in hunter-gatherer societies found recurring themes that transcend geography and culture entirely. Stories about a trickster figure who breaks the rules and pays a price. Stories about a great flood. Stories about the sky being inhabited by beings more powerful than humans. Stories about a time before this time, when the world was different and something was lost. These aren't coincidences. These are the operating system of human consciousness, running on every machine regardless of where it was manufactured. The same stories, told in different languages, around different fires, on different continents for hundreds of thousands of years. That's not culture. That's biology. Speaking of fire, we can't talk about ancient nights without talking about fire. Because fire was essentially the iPhone of prehistoric existence. It did everything. It cooked food, making nutrients more bioavailable, and allowing human brains to grow larger over generations. It provided warmth, extending the habitable range of our species into cold climates that would otherwise have been lethal. It kept predators away. Most animals are instinctively terrified of open flame, which, fair enough, is a very reasonable fear. But perhaps most underappreciated is fire's role in extending the human day. Before fire was controlled, humans probably did go to sleep shortly after sunset, simply because there was nothing else to do and nowhere safe to be. But once fire was mastered, and evidence suggests Homo erectus was controlling fire as far back as 1.7 million years ago, with more consistent use by 400,000 years ago, the night opened up. Suddenly there were hours of warm, relatively safe, socially rich time available every single day. Evolutionary biologists have actually argued that controlled fire and the nighttime social time it enabled played a direct role in the development of human cognition and language. You could genuinely argue that civilization itself was born around a campfire at midnight, which is a sentence that sounds poetic but is probably just literally true. Now let's talk about sleep, because ancient humans slept nothing like you do. And if you think your chaotic, guilty, never quite enough sleep schedule is a personal failing, it might actually be closer to ancient biology than you realize. The assumption that humans naturally sleep in one long 8-hour block is almost certainly wrong, and this has been known for a while now. Sleep scientist Jerome Siegel studied hunter-gatherer groups including the Hadza of Tanzania, the San of Namibia, and the Tsimane of Bolivia, and found that these groups consistently sleep in two distinct phases. They fall asleep a couple of hours after sunset, sleep for several hours, wake up naturally in the middle of the night for a period of quiet wakefulness lasting anywhere from 30 minutes to 2 hours, and then sleep again until after sunrise. This is called biphasic sleep, and it turns out it was considered completely normal for most of human history. Historian Roger Eckhart spent 16 years researching pre-industrial sleep patterns and found references to first sleep and second sleep in medieval documents, court records, diaries, and literature across Europe, Asia, and the Americas. People wrote about what they did between their two sleeps as casually as we write about what we do between lunch and dinner. It was just part of the daily rhythm. And then electric lighting arrived, workdays became standardized, and suddenly the entire architecture of human sleep was restructured around an industrial schedule. The epidemic of insomnia in modern societies, particularly the maddening tendency to wake up in the middle of the night and lie there anxious and frustrated, might not be a disorder at all. It might be your ancient brain correctly executing a program that the modern world no longer has a slot for. So what were ancient humans doing during that mysterious middle-of-the-night wakefulness? Probably a mix of things depending on the person and the season. Some would tend to the fire, which was a genuine necessity. Letting the fire go out overnight in a cold climate or predator-rich environment wasn't just uncomfortable, it was potentially fatal. Others might quietly talk, processing the events of the day in hushed tones while the rest of the camp slept. Some evidence suggests this was a time associated with particularly vivid and memorable dreaming, because the brain state during this wakeful period apparently produces elevated levels of prolactin, a hormone linked to feelings of calm, openness, and creative receptivity. Roger E. Kirch found historical references suggesting people in pre-industrial times considered this quiet middle-of-the-night period ideal for prayer, reflection, and what one medieval French physician described as the most propitious time for conception, which, honestly, tracks. Ancient humans almost certainly did not distinguish sharply between dream states and waking consciousness the way we do. Dreams weren't just noise from a sleeping brain. They were messages, visions, communications from ancestors or spirits or forces beyond ordinary perception. The liminal state of middle-of-the-night wakefulness, not quite asleep, not fully in the world of day, was probably considered sacred, meaningful, a window into something larger. Across virtually every ancient culture, nighttime was associated with the spirit world, with ancestors, with the kinds of truths that could only be perceived when the busy, practical, day-lit mind finally went quiet. This connects directly to ritual, which brings us to one of the most fascinating dimensions of ancient nightlife. And yes, ancient people absolutely had a nightlife, it just didn't involve overpriced cocktails and a bouncer checking your ID. Ritual was central to nighttime life in virtually every ancient culture we've studied. And this makes profound sense when you think about it. Night is inherently liminal. It's the threshold between one day and the next. The sky transforms into something unrecognizable. The sounds of the world change. Your senses sharpen in some directions and go completely blind in others. For a brain wired, deeply, evolutionarily wired, to find meaning in patterns and transitions, the shift from day to night would have been an irresistibly significant event. Not just practically, spiritually. Ancient humans performed nighttime rituals for everything. For health, for protection, for hunting success, for rain, for fertility, for the safe passage of the dead into whatever came next. These weren't naive superstitions performed by people who didn't understand the world. They were sophisticated psychological technologies developed over thousands of generations for managing the parts of existence that couldn't be controlled through practical action alone. Ritual creates certainty in the face of uncertainty. It creates community in the face of isolation. It creates meaning in the face of chaos. Ancient humans figured all of this out in the dark, and they weren't wrong about any of it. Now, the night sky. We cannot possibly talk about ancient human nights without spending serious time on what was, for hundreds of thousands of years, the most spectacular show in the world, running every single clear night above every human who ever lived. The night sky before light pollution is something almost no modern person has ever seen, and it's hard to overstate how different it is. You're not talking about a few bright dots. You're talking about a river of light arching across the entire sky. The Milky Way, our own galaxy, visible from horizon to horizon as a dense glowing band containing hundreds of billions of individual stars. The ancient night sky would have been overwhelming, incomprehensible in its scale, and ancient humans stared at it, every night, for hundreds of thousands of years. And they didn't just stare passively. They mapped it. They named it. They built entire mythological systems around it. The Pleiades star cluster, 7 stars grouped together in a distinctive tiny formation, appears in the mythology and cosmology of indigenous peoples across 6 continents, from the Aboriginal Australians to the Aztecs to the ancient Greeks to the Maori of New Zealand, none of whom had historical contact with each other. The simplest explanation is that the Pleiades have been culturally significant to humans since before those groups separated, which means before humans left Africa, which means the cultural significance of those 7 stars is potentially over 100,000 years old. Let that number sit with you for a moment. Ancient humans used the stars to track seasons, to predict the timing of animal migrations, to know when to move camp, to navigate across featureless landscapes and open oceans. The Polynesian navigators who colonized the Pacific Islands, sailing thousands of miles across open ocean with no instruments, did it using star knowledge accumulated and transmitted across generations through memorized songs and chants. The night sky was simultaneously a calendar, a compass, a religious text, and a map. It was the Google Maps, the Gregorian calendar, and the Bible, all projected onto the same ceiling and available to anyone who looked up. Let's talk about the art, because this is where things get genuinely mind-bending. Cave paintings. The ones in Lascaux in France, Altamira in Spain, Chauvet, El Castillo, have traditionally been imagined as daylight activities. But that's almost certainly wrong. These caves are deep underground. Some of the most elaborate paintings are found in passages so narrow and dark that even with modern lighting equipment, they're uncomfortable to access. Ancient artists working in these spaces were entirely dependent on small lamps burning animal fat, with wicks made of moss or lichen and torches made from bundled plant material. Researcher Yael Mathieu analyzed the flickering characteristics of ancient stone lamps and found that the movement of light across the painted walls would have made the animal figures appear to move, to breathe, to run. Close your eyes and actually imagine this for a second. You're in a cave, deep underground, so far from the entrance that no sound from the surface reaches you. The only light comes from a small lamp that flickers and gutters and throws dancing shadows across a surface covered in massive, expertly rendered bison, horses, mammoths, and rhinoceroses that seem, in the moving light, to be alive. The cave echoes. Your heartbeat is audible. You are surrounded by the images of creatures more powerful than you, rendered so skillfully and so large that they dominate your entire visual field. Whatever is happening in this space is not decorative. It is not a hobby project. It is an engineered, altered state experience, almost certainly tied to ritual, to initiation, to vision, to some ancient form of accessing something beyond ordinary consciousness. Ancient humans weren't painting on cave walls at night. They were building cathedrals. They just happened to use bison instead of stained glass. Then there's music. Ancient humans almost certainly sang and played instruments at night, and the evidence for this goes back further than most people realize. The oldest confirmed musical instruments are bone flutes carved from vulture wing bones and mammoth ivory, found in caves in southern Germany and dated to over 40,000 years ago. But these are just the instruments that survived. The vast majority of musical instruments throughout human history have been made of organic materials, stretched animal skins, hollow logs, reeds, wood, that leave no archaeological trace. The bone flutes we've found are almost certainly not the beginning of music. They're just the beginning of music that was made from materials hard enough to fossilize. Music around a fire at night isn't just entertaining, it's biologically functional. Synchronized rhythmic activity, singing together, clapping together, moving together, causes the release of endorphins in the brain, produces feelings of warmth and trust and connection toward the people you're doing it with, and literally synchronizes the heartbeats and breathing patterns of people who are doing it together. This is not a metaphor. Choir singers' hearts beat in synchrony. This is measurable. Ancient humans sitting around a fire and singing together were chemically bonding themselves to each other, building the trust that made coordinated hunting possible, building the loyalty that meant someone would watch over you while you slept. Music wasn't entertainment, it was social infrastructure. It was the original team-building exercise, except it actually worked. And then, almost inevitably, comes the question of what else happened around those ancient fires in the dark. The answer, if you're wondering, is everything else humans do. Flirting, arguing, reconciling, grieving, planning, scheming, parenting, eating, joking. Ancient humans were fully, completely, irreducibly human. They had politics, they had hierarchies, they had romantic entanglements and family drama, and people who talked too much and people who never said anything, and leaders whose authority was constantly being quietly questioned. All of that played out around the fire at night. Conflict resolution, interestingly, was often handled at night. Anthropological research on contemporary hunter-gatherer groups shows that disputes that would fester during the busy practical daytime, conflicts over resources, injuries to status, romantic complications, were often addressed in the evening, around the fire, with the entire community present. Night was a more emotionally open time. The atmosphere around a fire encourages a different kind of honesty, and having the whole group present meant that resolution was witnessed, and therefore real. The fire circle was the ancient equivalent of both a courtroom and a therapy session. Children, in all of this, were full participants. There were no ancient bedtimes. Data from hunter-gatherer communities consistently shows that children stay awake as long as adults, falling asleep when they're tired, often curled against an adult, often right there on the ground next to the fire, and sleeping into the morning. Ancient children weren't sent to a separate room with a picture book and a white noise machine. They were present for the stories, the rituals, the music, the disputes, the laughter, the grief. They absorbed the culture of their people not through formal instruction, but through total, unfiltered immersion in adult life from the earliest age. This is how knowledge transferred, not from textbook to student, from elder to child, across the warmth of a fire in the dark. What about fear? Because let's not paint this too warmly. The ancient night was genuinely, legitimately terrifying in ways that are hard for a modern person to fully appreciate. In the African savanna, where much of early human evolution occurred, the nighttime predator roster was not a joke. Lions, leopards, hyenas with bone-crushing jaws, wild dogs that hunt in coordinated packs, snakes that are invisible in darkness. Every rustle outside the fire's light was a potential threat. The human stress response is calibrated to the ancient night, hyper-vigilant, ready to explode into action at a fraction of a second's notice. This is why you still startle when someone walks up behind you, even in a perfectly safe modern environment. Your nervous system is still, at some very fundamental level, waiting for the leopard. But here's the paradox. Fear made them more social, not less. When you're genuinely afraid, you don't isolate. You cluster. You stay close to the warmth and the light and the people. Fear was, paradoxically, one of the most powerful social binding forces in ancient human communities. The people you survived the night with were the people you trusted. The people who stayed awake with you during the second watch, who kept the fire fed while you slept, who would scream a warning if something came out of the darkness, those were your people. Ancient human bands were forged in the dark as much as in the daylight. Terror, held together, becomes something else. Something that looks a lot like belonging. And this is the thread that runs through absolutely everything we've talked about. The storytelling, the music, the ritual, the stars, the art, the biphasic sleep, the children falling asleep to the murmur of adult voices. The ancient night was not a void to be endured. It was a space that humans actively shaped, filled, and made their own. Night was when the human capacity for meaning-making ran at full power. It was when the things that couldn't be said in the practical daylight finally got said. It was when the culture was transmitted, the bonds were deepened, the universe was contemplated, and the fire, always the fire, held the darkness back just far enough. We live differently now, radically differently. Most of us will never sit in genuine darkness and watch the stars for more than a few minutes. Most of us will never hear a story told by firelight by someone who learned it from someone who was told it by someone who was told it across an unbroken chain reaching back into a past we can barely imagine. Most of us will end the night alone, in an artificially lit box, staring at a screen, physically surrounded by more humans than any ancient person ever saw in a lifetime, but connected to almost none of them. But the programming is still there, every single bit of it. It's why fire still feels like safety. It's why a story told in the dark hits differently than a story told in daylight. It's why music heard in a crowd, surrounded by other warm bodies all moving together, produces something that feels almost like transcendence. It's why the night sky, when you actually see it, really see it, away from city lights, lying on your back in actual darkness, makes you feel simultaneously tiny and connected to something enormous. Your ancient brain knows exactly what all of this means. It's been waiting, patiently, for you to remember. So the next time someone asks what ancient humans did at night, here's the real answer. They did what humans have always done when the work is done, and the dark comes. In and the fire is lit and the people are close. They lived. Fully, deeply, completely. They lived.